maybe. Okay. We're laying down the foundation today for the 4 weeks of looking at the other Gospels. And I'm sorry, that means today is basically lecture mode, but I promise that will change next week. And I'll try to move through the slides efficiently so we have at least a few minutes at the end for talk back. Oh, false advertising. I said we're dealing with the other Gospels, but today we're really dealing with early church history. I don't know if Alfred Loisy is a name you know. He was a French Roman Catholic, leader around 1900 in their liberalizing movement. He was a professor, priest, theologian, and this is his best-known smart alecky aphorism. You will not be surprised to hear that eventually he was excommunicated. That's going to be a motif this morning, I'm afraid. Okay. You know, I'm assuming that there were other early interpretive biographies written about Jesus. Anybody know how many? It was a trick question, Jeff. You're absolutely right. We only know what we know. And what we know today is about a score, maybe 21, 22. We have references to that many, or fragments, or complete texts. All right? Can anybody name any of them?
Proto-Evangelium of James.
Okay. The Proto-Evangelium, of James. Gospel of Thomas. That's the best known. Gospel of Mary Magdalene. Who?
Wasn't there one with Thecla or Paul?
Oh, the Acts of Paul and Thecla. Not a gospel, but a very... Thecla is Nedra's patron saint, so a very important book to her.
My favorite, the Gospel of Judas Iscariot.
Oh, yes. Can you believe that? That'd be interesting to read. Too bad it's not really by him. Okay.
Shepherd of Hermas.
That's an excellent... Not a gospel, though. Not a gospel, though. The early Christians scribbled all the time. For a bunch of people who were basically illiterate, they wrote an awful lot of stuff. Letters, sermons, dialogues, and we'll be talking about some of the others, but our focus is going to be on the Gospels, okay? All right? Whether you've read any of them or heard of any of them or not, have you formed any opinions about them? Are you for them or against them?
I haven't read them, but I'm really interested. I've heard that they're not inspired by the Holy Spirit.
You've heard that?
I've heard they're not inspired by the Holy Spirit, but I haven't actually read any of them.
Okay. I've got some names up here. You recognize many of them. Biblical scholars are all over the place about the other Gospels. Some say they're not inspired. End of discussion. Some get all goosebumpy and excited about them. Yeah.
I've read the Gospel of Thomas.
Yeah.
I thought it was meritorious. There are a lot of sayings in there I had trouble understanding. And it seems like that would be a good use of time to...
Are you able to come next week?
Yes.
Next week we're going to read the Gospel of Thomas together and clear up all the questions of ever... Yeah.
I guess I'm curious on what the politics of these being excluded were, right? Because there's a spiritual dimension to this, and then there's a whole political dimension of like, if you didn't fit the presiding interpretation of the time, and so why can't we include them?
Okay, Mary, don't fall asleep. That's exactly what we're looking at today.
Well, aside from the socio-political, which is an element, there is also the theological consideration that these other Gospels are generally classified as the Gnostic Gospels, and this theology of a secret knowledge is not really consistent with the theology of the Scriptures that did land in the canon.
Ken, that is what we're going to talk about next week. So if you can be here. Okay, and if you can't, as I say, we're going to try making the recordings available to people. Okay. I have, speaking of scholars, 2 books I would like to recommend. Both are recent. Both are Oxford University Press. Both are Bart Ehrman from UNC Chapel Hill. And I recommend him simply because, well, he's a very highly regarded scholar, but I recommend him because he's an unusual scholar in that he writes clearly and entertainingly. Law scriptures will give you a lot of the early Christian scribblings that did not make it into the New Testament. And Lost Christianities will tell you a lot about the communities that produced them, okay? And Jeff, you want to hold up your book you wrote this morning and mention it?
It's a biblical canon. It's the story of both the Old Testament Jewish canonization of whatever we wanted to keep, and then also the New Testament. That's it.
The guy's name is McDonald.
It is by Lee McDonald, Hendrickson Publishers.
Yeah. Okay. Of course, there are many other books, but I'll have these available up here. And Jeff, I don't know if you'd stay.
And then Chatsworth's books of Old and New Testament as well.
Okay. So I don't know if you'd stay if anyone wants to see that after for just a minute. We have to break at 10:20, and I want to do that. Okay. Here's our plan. Always good to know what the map is. Here's our plan. Next week, as I said, we're going to talk about the discovery of the so-called Gnostic Gospels of Nag Hammadi, and we will together clear up all of the questions ever raised about the Gospel of Thomas. And then the third week, we'll do a superficial survey of the rest of the scores. So, and then the fourth week, we'll look with a microscope at just a couple, including Judas and Mary. Make sense? All right. Welcome. I had a professor in college who used to insist, always begin by defining your terms. And that's not a bad idea. So what do we mean by non-canonical gospel? Well, pretty simple. Kanon was a Greek word that means tool. If you look it up, you'll find examples. They would, for instance, tie the end of a string around a rock and use it as a plumb line to test whether a wall was straight, was vertical. Or they would strip some fibers off the outside of a papyrus stalk. Think about the outside of fibers on celery. And then they would use those as a ruler or a straight edge to help draw a straight line. So by extension, kanon came to mean any tool that helps you build a straight wall, walk a straight line, live a straight Christian life. We talk about the Shakespeare canon. Jim, 36 or so books that we think Shakespeare actually wrote, the list. That's a canon. And of course, we have the New Testament canon, the book that the church decided eventually were really holy and really inspired. The word for gospel, we don't go to the Greeks for that. We go to the Anglo-Saxons. Two Old English words, go to spell, good, and spell, white magic. So gospel is kind of white magic. It's a little bit more clear if you go to the Greek. Their word was euangelion. Our Gospel of Mark begins, the beginning of the euangelios, the beginning of the good news about Jesus. All right? Originally, euangelion seems to have been the tip that you gave the Western Union telegraph boy for bringing you good news. And words changed. Over time, it came to mean the contents of the telegram. So a gospel is an interpretive biography that tells people the good news about Jesus. Pretty simple. All right, I said scholars are all over the place, and you've been sitting there wondering to yourself, I wonder what John thinks. You have been wondering, right? Well, since I'm running the class today, it's my prerogative to tell you what I think. I don't think most of them are all that interesting in themselves. And I don't think they give us a lot of new insights into Jesus. But I do think they're awfully important for us Christians to know something about. Very simply, because they help to prove that Vincent Laurent was wrong and Walter Bauer was right. End of class.
Oh, that's easy.
Here's what I mean. This may or may not be what my French pronunciation is so atrocious, I'm going to English him. This is what somebody thinks Vincent of Lerins looked like. Around 450 or so, he composed what we call the Vincentian canon. There's that word again. He composed a verbal formula in Latin, a tool to help Christians get a grip on Christianity. He said we have got to hold fast to the faith which has been believed everywhere, always, by everyone. Did I get the three terms in sequence? Everywhere, always, by everyone. Okay, you may never have heard of Vincent, and you may never have heard of the Vincentian canon, but I know you've run into that concept, right? In my childhood, my parents raised me to think that the version of Christianity in our Baptist family was the original, pure, pristine form. Nedra was raised by the Ursuline nuns to think that their version of Christianity was the original, pure, pristine, pure form. I was taught that as time passed, interlopers started messing it up and confusing things, people like, the Catholics. And Nedra was taught that people like the Baptists came along and started introducing heresies. But for most of the last 2,000 years, we Christians have told ourselves that Christianity started out as something clear, clean, simple, pure, and then over time, like barnacles on the hull of a ship, over time confusion set in, so that we end up with today's very, very confused phenomenon, modern Christianity. This imposing gentleman is more or less what Walter Bauer looked like. Bauer was obviously a German biblical scholar, who in 1934 published a book that translates as Orthodoxy and Heresy in Earliest Christianity. Today, I have some books that are owned by scholars who claim that this is the single most important biblical book to come out of the 20th century. Today, my impression is that virtually all scholars of the Bible say his thesis is correct and Vincent is wrong. What was his thesis? He turned Vincent inside out and upside down. He said, no, Christianity from the very get-go was a very diverse phenomenon. And then, over a couple of hundred years, one of the many competing varieties managed to establish itself as mainstream. Now, Bauer had bad timing. His book came out in 1934 and didn't even make a splash in the little bitty pond of biblical scholarship. The world was, you remember, preoccupied with other things coming out of Germany in 1934. His book was finally translated into English 3.5 decades later, and in 1971, and it was English-speaking scholars, English-reading scholars, who then turned it into a bombshell bestseller in the small world of scholarship. Well, again, he had bad timing because Bauer had been dead for 10 or 11 years by that point. He didn't get to see himself become famous in the world of scholarship. All of this raises, of course, the natural question. We know how confusing Christianity can be today with all the different ideologies, denominations. How could anything be more diverse than this? I'll go to Bart Ehrman. Here's a page of examples. And I think the font is large enough, you don't need me. I'll give you a moment to look this over. These are some of the things that early Christians believed.
Is it that much different today?
I'm sorry?
Is your opinion that much different anymore? It seems pretty
Well, I don't know too many Christians today who would say there were 365 gods, one for every day of the year.
I'd be surprised.
Well, you're probably right. Shows what I know. But this is pretty remarkable for the get-go, right? And probably a good moment to take a break, a little more Greek. We're going to be using 3 terms in these 4 weeks. 2 of them have already cropped up. Orthodoxy, heresy, and proto-orthodox. Orthodoxy, you probably know. Think doxology, praise. Think orthodontics, make your teeth right. Orthodoxy is the right way to praise or worship God. And heresis in Greek simply means choice, by implication, wrong choice. So how I worship God is orthodox. How you worship God is probably heretical. We know how that game gets played. The third term, proto-orthodox, proto-precursor. This is the term that scholars use to refer to that group among many in earliest Christianity who eventually, as Bauer says, managed to stamp themselves as mainstream. And today I'll be talking a lot about them. Great.
Another way of looking at orthodoxy I've seen written many
Yeah.
places is not just right praise, but right thinking.
Oh, you're about 2 slides ahead of me. Thank you. Thank you. So the question, naturally, is how did the proto-Orthodox become Orthodox? Well, how did they manage to beat out all the others and emerge as mainstream? I've been fascinated by this question for, half a century. And as a result, I figured out, without oversimplifying too much, how to make it clear and simple and easy. Plus, I played around with the thesaurus and came up with 3 words beginning like Christianity with C. That helps. Their strategy, whether fully conscious or not, their strategy was tripartite. I'm sorry, Jim, you're sweating also. Is it?
No.
I think we're dropping. It will be working, but we were trying to keep the sound off because it's hard to hear them. What, Andrew? Oh, okay. You're comfortable? Okay. Ignore me. I'm working. Yeah. Okay. Clergy, creed, and canon. And today, in a couple of minutes, we'll gallop through these 3. All right? You know that the New Testament gives us a couple of different models about how to organize a bunch of Christians. A church, a parish, a foyers group like ours last night. There's the Pauline model, where the founder of the church plays dictator. That's nice, that's real simple, but what happens when the boss is out of town or after he dies? 1st and 2nd Corinthians tell us what happened. Chaos. Another model in the New Testament is the Johannine. The community that gave us the Gospel of John, 1 John, 2 John, 3 John, they tried to practice leadership by the Holy Spirit, which is a great way to stir up grassroots enthusiasm. But there's no reason why I can't get up and say, I think the Spirit is saying A, and Edward gets up and says, no, I think the Spirit is saying B. And if you look at 1 and 2 John, that's exactly the chaos that they ran into. Another possibility comes out of course, the Hebrew tradition, the Jewish tradition. That is leadership by prophets, people like Samuel, Jeremiah. In the 2nd century, for example, there was a church leader named Montanus. He relied on 2 women prophets, Prisca and Maximilla. They would go to Montanus and say, the Spirit says X and Y, and then he would pass the word on to his followers. The emerging proto-Orthodox church said, no, the age of prophecy is now over. Now the Holy Spirit speaks through us. And they excommunicated him. There was a lot of that going on, you begin to perceive. In the 3rd century, the great Tertullian, the great apologist, meaning writer of defenses, not apologies, Tertullian was still trying to defend prophetic leadership, and guess what? They ended up kicking him out. The Proto-Orthodox came up with another way of organizing their church, one that is not in the New Testament. They came up with, the plural is episkopoi, the singular is episkopos. They came up with what you and I call bishops. All right? If you've ever wondered how we get the word bishop out of episkopos, you lie awake at night wondering about that, right? Take a look at this. You know that when we import foreign words into English, we often drop an initial E. We say school, not the Spanish escuela. Student, not estudiante. We drop the initial E, and the Omicron sigma at the end. The history of English is that bit by bit we've been getting rid of inflectional endings. So we get rid of that ending that shows a singular nominative case. And the sigma kappa, the SK, in classical Greek and Latin, they pronounced it as SK. And then after the classical period, for some reason, they changed to SH in pronunciation. So the great Cicero wrote an early novel called Somnium Scipionis. We call it The Dream of Scipio. He would have said Scipio. We say Scipio. And so we changed the SK to an SH sound. And you know that P and B illustrate something we call voiced and voiceless consonant pairs. They're very close together. If you shape your speaking apparatus and pass air through your lips, the sound comes out P. If you don't pass air through your lips, it comes out B. So they're very close together. The P changed into a B. You put all that together and you get bishop. Actually, epi is a Greek prefix that means on, above, over. And scopeo, think about words like periscope, telescope, means to see. So the word itself means overseer. Cool, huh? So the Proto-Orthodox came up with a rigid hierarchy for their structure. Bishops, and under them priests, and under them deacons, and teachers of classes, and so forth. They also have one other interesting wrinkle that, to me as an ex-Baptist, is really weird, but some of you probably buy it completely. We call it apostolic succession. When Jesus says to Peter in Matthew, "To you are given the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven," and so forth. The Proto-Orthodox decided that Jesus was appointing Simon Peter as the first bishop of Rome. And he then laid hands on others that he designated. Some churches still do that, I understand. Laid hands on other people to ordain them to also be bishops. It was a great attempt by the Proto-Orthodox to make sure that today's leadership determined what tomorrow's leadership was going to think. Ken?
With respect, and I don't want to
Yeah.
interpret what you're saying,
Yeah.
you might not be denying this, but Episcopal, Presbyteroi, and Diaconoi, those three orders
Yeah.
that we have today are all referenced in the New Testament.
They are, but what we think of as a bishop is not what Paul was talking about, we think. Don't tell us your Roman Catholic neighbors, but the first bishops seem to have been very early in the 2nd century, what we think of as bishops, people like Clement of Rome. In fact, what I keep running into in history books is that the Bishop of Rome did not emerge as a kind of pope for the West, at least, until the 8th century. But don't tell your Catholic friends that.
Right.
Yeah. Okay.
John?
Yeah.
So isn't it also true that a lot of the Episcopal system that began to develop by the Proto-Orthodox modeled on the Roman empirical governance system?
Oh, man. I should sit down and have you teach this class. We're going to be there in just a minute, I promise. Man, you're good. Are you clairvoyant? If you're interested, a lot of scholars today don't think that the illiterate Galilean fisherman, Simon Peter, even ever made it to Rome. I know you go there and they'll show you not one but two tombs of Peter. There are all these wonderful church legends about being crucified upside down by Nero. But if you're interested, this is a recent, very clear, very short article, I think it was this past March, by a scholar from Brown University that explains why scholars are skeptical. You don't have to memorize that. Just send me an email and I'll get the link to you. But anyway, that's clergy. Their structure really was a brilliant insight for them. The second part of the tripartite strategy that enabled them to go mainstream was creeds. You know that there are lots of Christians who don't use creeds, don't have any desire to put God in a word box. When I was growing up Baptist, we had no creed. The United Church of Christ says our creed is love on their website. I like that. Methodists, Quakers, a lot of Christians don't feel a need for creeds. We, of course, recite the Nicene Creed every Sunday. Well, not really. It was the Nicene Creed as revised in Constantinople and Chalcedon, but we call it the Nicene Creed. And we can blame the Emperor Constantine for that. You remember that in 312, the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, Constantine unites the Roman Empire under his leadership. The next year, he issues the Edict of Milan, which wasn't really an edict, it had nothing to do with Milan, in which he ordered the empire to stop persecuting Christians. And a decade after that, he summoned the bishops, by then, the bishops of the emerging Orthodox Church, and said, look, guys, I told Rome to stop beating up on you so that you could be a prop to help support the empire. And instead, you're wasting your time and energy squabbling with each other. That's not helpful. Now, in Rome, we have our law, and our lex is written down. I want you to get together, and he convened the Council of Nicaea. They just discovered the church where the council met. It's under a lake in Turkey. Send me an email, and I'll send you the information. He said, I want you to have a council and get together and write down a statement that says what Christians have to believe. So he convened Nicaea. That got me interested in researching the catechumenate last year. That's another New Testament word. Paul uses it in Galatians. It's how we train neophyte Christians, how we get people ready for baptism and so forth. What I discovered was, I didn't know this, in the first centuries, the catechumenate was all about ethics. Christians do this, they don't do that. And then, in the 3rd and especially 4th centuries, it came to be about beliefs. Christians think this, they don't think that. It was also, of course, in the 4th century when the great creeds got off and running. We claim we have now 7 great ecumenical creeds. We actually have hundreds of Christian creeds. But the most famous is the Nicene Creed. And it seems like Constantine was completely successful. Yes, that solved all of the problems, all the squabbling ended. End of class. How many of you know the name Nestorius? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Right here, 7. We have a cliche that says history is written by the victors. Nestorius was a winner for a long time, and then he was a loser. This is somebody's perception much later of what Nestorius looked like. And this is really cool. I'll take a brief digression here. Nestorius is wonderful proof that Vincent was wrong and Dara was right and continues to be right. Nestorius was not just the bishop, but the Archbishop of Constantinople, one of the 5 great sees, a full century after Nicaea, and he was anti-Nicene Creed. He said, for instance, Mary was not Theotokos, God-bearer. Jesus was not the pre-existent member of the Trinity conceived of at Nicaea. And he had a lot of followers. They were called the Church of the East. Well, the Orthodox Church eventually decided that he was wrong and kicked him out. Here we go again. At the Council of Ephesus, 450 or something. Here's a wonderful name, Jaroslav Pelikan, the late great church historian from Yale. In one of his books I have at home, he says, I was so astonished when I first read this, and then I found out everybody but me knew it. He says that for fully 1,000 years after Nicaea, the largest group of Christians geographically in America and the world were Nestorian, not Nicene. Vincent was wrong. Okay? And then what happened? Well, in the 14th century, the followers of Genghis Khan and Tamerlane massacred the Church of the East. They were all over Mongolia, China, India, and that's why nobody knows Nestorius except 6 people in this room. Oh, I'm number 7, okay. There are still a few Nestorian Christians in places like Iraq and Syria, but basically, that's what happened. Okay, end of digression, and back to...
The latest conqueror of the East has destroyed most of that church.
I'm sorry?
The latest conqueror of Iraq and Iran has destroyed most of that church in Syria. It's called,
You mean that's ISIS?
called the American government. We started a war that drove all those Christians out.
I suspect that you and I would have a lot of political agreements, Greg, but we won't go there. Okay. The third part of the tripartite winning strategy was canon. We now know that there were lots of early Christian writings, and they were all over the place in their theology. But the emerging proto-Orthodox party said, we've got to decide which of the books really are holy and get rid of all the others. And they had the example, of course, of the rabbis. You know that when Jesus was alive, there was no Hebrew Bible yet. Instead, there were arguments. The Sadducees wanted a small canon of 5 books, the Mosaic books. The Pharisees wanted a much larger group of books. And then along came the war with Rome, 66 to 70, or Masada fell in 73. And leadership passed from the Sadducees and the Herodians and those people into the hands of the Pharisees. And it was then the Pharisees who presided at what we call the Synod of Jamna or Yavnia, which in the 90s decided which of the candidate books should be in the Hebrew Bible. The victors get the spoils. And that's why we have a big Old Testament. Because the Christians said, the proto-Orthodox Christians said, thanks for going all that trouble for us. We'll rubber stamp your decision. We'll reorder the books, and we'll call them Part 1 of the Christian Bible. And then they went right on arguing about what should be in Part 2. We know, for instance, in 140, one of the leaders in the church at Rome named Marcion proposed a canon for the New Testament consisting of 7 books attributed to Paul and the Gospel of Luke. Well, guess what? The emerging Orthodox Church decided that Marcion was a heretic and kicked him out, and so there went his canon. The first list we know of, with our 27 New Testament books, dates to 367, when Athanasius, the emperor, the bishop of Alexandria, he thought he was emperor, but the bishop of Alexandria in Egypt sent a letter around to the people under his domain, and he said, this is a list of the 27 books I want you to consider holy for Christians. Get rid of the others. All right? It took a while, even among proto-Orthodox Christians, for Athanasius' list to win the day. And even after it did, they went on squabbling because which version of the book? We know today of 7 different versions of chapter 16 of Mark. And more than that, which translation? We're still squabbling over that. Evangelicals gravitate towards the King James or the New International. You and I probably go to the Revised Standard or the New Revised Standard, right? In 384, the Bishop of Rome, who I would say was not yet Pope, whose name was Damasus, he turned to his personal secretary, you know him, Jerome, and he said, I want you to make a Latin translation of the 27 books on Athanasius' list. And I will put my imprimatur on them, and we'll see if we can get at least Western Latin-speaking Christians to agree on this is the New Testament canon. That, of course, is the Vulgate, from the Latin word meaning common. When my mother called somebody common, she meant vulgar in a bad sense, but in common use. That was the dream. And, of course, we're still squabbling over that stuff. But canon was clearly one of the ways that the early proto-Orthodox Church triumphed. Simple, right? And so there you have the beginning. And I was so efficient, we actually have about 10 minutes for you to correct. And not only that, but also ask questions that Greg can answer. Okay? The show is yours.
Can you go one slide back?
One slide back. Yeah, Tom.
You mentioned that Marcion had proposed a canon and was excommunicated. I understand that he also had the position that there were 2 different gods, the God of the Old Testament and the God of the New Testament.
Yeah. Yeah, anti-Semitism got off and running at different times in different places. There's a recent book I have at home, you're welcome to borrow, edited by Herschel Shanks, Biblical Archaeology Review, Bible Review. It pulls together a bunch of Christian and Jewish historians about when exactly what's called the parting of the ways took place. And I repeat, it took place, it turns out, at different speeds and in different places at different times and so forth. Roughly by 300, it had pretty well happened. But Marcion was one of the early anti-Jewish Christian leaders. He said that the God of the Old Testament was bad. Had nothing. Jesus' God was a very different figure from that one. The Episcopal Barnabas is one of our earliest Christian writings that is virulently anti-Jewish. And by the way, I said it took a while for the Vulgate to conquer the West. The great codices from the 4th and 5th century, Alexandrinus, Vaticanus, Sinaiticus, they have a number of our 27 books in them, but they also include other books like the Shepherd of Hermas, 1st and 2nd Clement, the Epistle of Barnabas, that many of the early Christians wanted to be in the canon. But yeah, Marcion's father was a bishop somewhere around the Black Sea, it seems. And the young Marcion left home to go to Rome to make his fame and fortune. He immediately wrote a big check to the church in Rome, and surprised, the next thing we know, he's one of their leaders. Yeah, his dad made his fortune also, but he made it in shipbuilding, not in theology. Yes?
Too basic. Could you talk more about Athanasius and drawing up the first official canon list? What criteria are we aware that he used, and not only for the Gospels, but for the letters and epistles as well? Do you have any sense of that, or was it just what was common? I've been told a lot of it was the result of what was being commonly used in churches, sort of generally accepted.
Well, in proto-Orthodox churches.
Proto-Orthodox.
In Egypt, at least.
Yeah.
Athanasius is one of the most interesting figures in the early church. Oh man, he lived a long life. He had so much influence. He was tied in with the Desert Fathers, and he used to have them serve as his personal thugs when he would be in an argument with somebody in Alexandria. We know of occasions where he called the desert monks to come in and beat up on them. Athanasius is going to be a big figure next week when we talk about the discovery of the Dead Sea, of the Gnostic Gospels. We think they were buried because of this letter in 367. And the monks that buried the Gnostic Gospels did so apparently thinking that they would have an opportunity to come back and resuscitate these old writings. And they had good reason to think so because Athanasius was bounced in and out as bishop 5 times. Okay? But his criteria for those 27 books, who can answer that?
You have Irenaeus right way back in the 2nd century, which it's pretty much almost the same except for Revelation, I believe.
Except for Revelation, that took a while, yeah. But do we know the criteria? I don't remember.
Well, and there was somebody that talked about it at Nicaea too, wasn't there? As well. I mean, they came up with the creed, but I think there was also a discussion around the canon at that point too.
There was. One of the things that Constantine did, he didn't just convene a council and say, give me a creed, but he also said he wanted to make a gift to the Orthodox bishops and their churches of 50 Bibles. Well, they didn't have a Bible yet. So that was obviously imperial pressure to get their act together on a canon decision, right? But it took obviously quite a bit of time. By the way, Constantine, when he died, his son who succeeded him was an Arian. Arius was Athanasius' big opponent in the Nicene Council. For a long time, the emperors went back and forth between those who adhered to Nicene theology and those who were Arian. One was even pagan. He only survived, 6 months or something. That didn't work. Who am I thinking of? Julian the Apostate. Okay. So I don't know, Robin, exactly what, maybe, I don't know.
It feels like that many of the ones that stayed, that were kept, enforce the idea of a church-based theology.
Good.
As opposed to an individualistic theology. So, like you talked about, the more mystical or more what we sometimes call Gnostic, which is not really a true way of calling it.
That's right.
But that we're not focused on, the idea was that you find salvation in the church, not in your own spiritual life.
And
so that's why you came to the church.
I think you're absolutely right. I'll bet there's the answer. Yeah, Tom?
The non-canonical Gospels, to what extent are they classified as Gnostic?
Okay. I promise we'll get into that whole discussion yesterday. It's not clear that all of them were. In fact, one of them, from Malcolm is written in a Gnostic style by a proto-Orthodox Christian trying to undermine it. But most of them seem to have had a Gnostic orientation, whatever the word Gnostic means. And a lot of scholars today think it's such a loose term, we might as well get rid of it. We'll talk about Gnosticism next week, I promise. But back to Athanasius for a moment. When the church put its New Testament canon together, when the Orthodox Church put its canon together, it put Matthew first. And Matthew is always called a church manual, right? Well, for example, Jesus is quoted as saying, when you have a disagreement between two members of the ecclesia of the church, have them get together and try to work it out. If that fails, pull in a third member of the church as mediator. If that doesn't work, take it before the whole church and excommunicate one of them. Obviously, Jesus didn't say that. But the emerging Orthodox Church liked Matthew a lot. Or you take the pastoral epistles, which most modern scholars think Paul did not write. 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus are all about the importance of church structure, right?
Just to muddy the waters a little bit.
Yeah.
In the broader picture of Scripture beyond the Gospels, just so that we don't get too focused on this bad old Roman Empire model.
Yeah.
Or the Hebrew Scriptures. Before the Council of General that you referenced, there was the Council of Jerusalem, which included those block scriptures that we now call the Apocrypha.
That's right.
And that the Roman Church counts as part of the canon of Scripture. And that early Christian movement embraced those books in the canon. And that was a debate in Judaism over whether to accept as canon books that were originally written outside of Hebrew. Because the Deuterocanonical books are written in Greek.
And there's some Aramaic in there as well. And yeah, some of our Bibles have the Apocrypha, some don't. Again, we're still disagreeing about what exactly the canon of the Bible should be. Yeah. Apocrypha means what? Hidden? These were the hidden books. They were sort of in and sort of out, Okay, it's 16 after, but is this working? 16 after? So we have a couple of minutes. This is great. Yeah.
I tried to remember back about 45 years. But
Whoa, Raz, you're that old?
yeah, there were, then I read about the mystery religion for
Yeah.
centuries. Resurrection religions that were not Christianity. Do you feel that these had a role in this diversification of these other gospels that came out?
You all know something about the mystery religions that came out of the East, gave the Roman Empire a lot of grief. Mithras and so forth. There are some scholars, I don't think it's a consensus, there are some scholars who argue that we should seek early Christianity as a mystery religion from the East. You've run into that? For instance, for many of them, there were secret teachings. We'll get into Gnosticism next week. There were secret teachings for the insiders. There were private meetings. There were secret rituals. They had baptism. They had a meal. Union with God, either now or in the hereafter. Their God, or their gods. I just finished reading one book, I skimmed it, one book about the mystery religions that says, like Gnosticism, it's a term that is so broad, so inclusive, it's really not that useful. I don't know. That's a long way of saying, I don't know, Rez. You thought I wouldn't say that, did you? Okay, Ned was yelling at me that we should break. So I hope I can see you next week, and I hope these tapes work if any of your friends say, oh, wow, what's